So I'm a huge fan of fighting axes. You know, axes, whether they're little axes like this tomahawk here or massive axes like this Danish great axe, have been around for an awful lot of history all over the world, and they're one of the weapons that you just can never make go away because axes are also tools. And specialised fighting axes like these are weapons that I've sung the praises of in many videos. And in Europe's medieval period, we start to get specialised axes to deal with the armour of the day that ultimately end up in these amazing pole axes, which are one of the few weapons which can really deal out damage to plate armour. But while axes have all sorts of advantages, which we've looked at in previous videos, I'm sure we'll look at again in the future, I'm going to outline here 5 kind of underappreciated and obscure disadvantages to axes. Not to say they're bad, but 5 distinct and often overlooked disadvantages to axes. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now we're going to be looking here at axes, and axes come in a huge variety of different forms and have been used as fighting implements in North America, South America, all over Africa, all over Asia and Europe, even New Zealand as well. The Maoris liked a good old axe. Now often when we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of axes, obviously that's a relative thing, but very often on this channel we'll be comparing it with swords. So some of the points I'm going to make here are relevant disadvantages of axes compared to swords. And just to state once again that I love axes of all sorts, whether it's little tomahawks like this or medieval kind of spiked axes like this for overcoming various types of armour. And they have a huge number of advantages, but that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at disadvantages. So the very first one that's going to come up could be seen as an advantage. So one of the beautiful things about axes, whether they're long or small, is you've got an awful lot of handle to play with, an awful lot of grip. And obviously when we're talking about something really big, like the two-handed axe as featured on the Bayeux tapestry, for example, and used in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, you can find it even pretty much unadulterated this in the 13th century still. Very successful weapon, and because you've got so much handle to play with, the entire shaft is part of the weapon and can be used offensively and defensively, okay? But that is also something which goes against it. I want you to imagine for a second that you're unarmed, disarmed perhaps, and you're being attacked with someone with an axe or someone with a sword. See, one of the big disadvantages of trying to defend yourself unarmed, well, against any weapon, but particularly against something like a sword, is it has a huge long edge. Okay, now in comparison, an axe has a pretty short edge. I mean, even the big Dane axe has a long edge relative to an axe, but still compared to the whole length of the weapon, the edge is only a small part of it. And this means that these weapons are relatively easy to grab. That means a bit of self-defense or HEMA advice for you here. If someone's swinging an axe one or two-handed at you, then one of the very good things and advisable things you can do is to close in as quickly as possible and grab that shaft. If you can get control of this weapon, you stop that thing from hitting you. Now this is something which you can do with knives and swords, and in fact we find it in pretty much all knife defense, and even we find grabbing of blades absolutely both in European and Asian, whether it's Japanese, Korean, Chinese or whatever, martial arts. So absolutely grabbing and controlling a blade, usually by grabbing the flats, is something we find against swords and knives. However, it's technically much more difficult than against an axe, because the axe is mostly made of handle. While we focus on the offensive bit at the top here, most of the weapon is exactly designed for holding. And therefore, if it's being used against you, this is a really good thing to grab and control. So they're quite weak when it comes to people grabbing your weapon. Unlike a sword, it's relatively easy to do. Now the next one is really obscure, and I suspect that most people watching this won't have thought of this. But if we look at the axe as an object, we have essentially an axis or a lever going up the center here, and then the edge is set forward of that. Now this is to some extent true of knives and swords as well, and particularly if they're curved or forwards leaning, like a kukri for example. But generally speaking, the line of the lever, okay, the sort of central axis, is very close in proximity to the edge. That means that small deviations in the hand or grip don't make a literal very big difference in the placement of the edge. Okay, now, if I grab the Dane axe where it's going to be more evident, wow, it's got a nice ring to it, right, so we will notice that a small movement here makes a big movement of where the edge is. Okay, I'll do it with a different angle here. So if this is perfectly aligned, let's align it with the camera, there we go. So you can see that the central shaft is perfectly aligned to the edge here, but a tiny movement of the shaft makes a big diversion of the edge. Why is that important? Well, quite simply, whether you're using a sword or an axe, you're intending to hit with the edge if you're using it in historical combat. Now, if you hit with the flat, you won't do very much damage. You'll do a little bit of blunt impact damage, less with the sword than with the axe, and that's an advantage of an axe, in fact. But generally speaking, where the edge is well set forward of this point of rotation, small movements can lead to the edge being in wildly different places than you intend. And in fact, people who regularly chop wood or chop trees down, for example, occasionally, you know, you'll hit a knot or a hard piece of wood, or perhaps a nail in the wood or something like this. And what usually happens is it deflects the edge and then the whole weapon slaps flat. Now, in a combat situation, that can be quite disadvantageous. It can lead to even losing a grip on the weapon sometimes, but for the most part, it just really messes with your control. So one of the subtle but quite important disadvantages of axes is that because the edge is well set forward of the sort of rotational lever, when you turn it a little bit, the edge travels a long way, which isn't the case where the edge is closer to the line of movement. Now, the next kind of relatively obscure disadvantage to axes is they're not really that well suited to wearing. Now, absolutely, you can wear them, and they were worn. So whether it was a tomahawk like this, which could be stuffed in the belt, and that is actually relatively easy to wear. Even if we go back to Swiss manuscripts from the 15th century, we can see axes which look a little bit more like this one being worn through the belt in exactly the same way. So the standard way of wearing an axe is to shove it through your belt. But here's the problem. Unlike a sword, which lives in a scabbard, okay, axes don't. Now, I know there have been in modern times axe scabbards made, but they're quite a modern thing. They didn't really exist historically very much as far as I can see. So one of the big advantages of knives and swords is they live in a scabbard and they become easy to wear and easy to draw. But when this is being worn, number one, it's not that easy to get out of the belt. But secondly, you've got these rather two or sometimes one offensive bits sticking out right next to your body. Now, I've noticed that some of my axes are very well sharpened. This is being an example of one of those. I mean, this will pop hairs off the arm. And you don't really want to be wearing that close to your body, for obviously because you've got a sharp edge, but you also have points at top and bottom. So if this is worn flush against the side down there, if you're running or moving vigorously, your kind of hip or upper leg can hit that bottom point. If you bend over, you can hit that point. And obviously this is a sharp edge that you can easily clip with your elbow or arm and, you know, cut you wide open. And the problem is that if you have a spike on the back or any kind of other offensive thing balancing up the blade, then that's also a problem. Do you wear this with the spike to the back, or do you wear it with the spike to the front? You can hurt yourself either way, or indeed your colleagues and the people that are standing next to you. So one of the big disadvantages of axes, in my opinion, is despite the fact that they were worn historically, shoved through the belt usually, sometimes through a ring on the belt, and this is a little bit of a better solution. This is like one step up. Overall, axes are not really comfortable things to either wear or draw, and swords certainly have kind of one up on them as far as that's concerned. Okay, one of the other disadvantages of axes becomes quite evident if you do HEMA or reenactment living history, perhaps even LARP as well. If you're using a weapon where fundamentally you have an awful lot of offensiveness at the end, but the rest of it is just a stick, and you don't have a thrusting point, which is true of most axes, some of them do admittedly, but most of them don't. One of the kind of areas where they really kind of lack when we're comparing it to something like a sword is in close. In other words, in a grappling, very close scenario. We're talking about elbowing, headbutting, kneeing, and pommeling kind of distance. Why? Because they've got less offensive bits. Fundamentally, the axe works by swinging. Now, swinging is not what you want to do when you're in very close. If we just swap to the sword for a second, generally speaking, if someone comes to grappling or wrestling range, even boxing range with a sword, you're starting to pull draw cuts into it, push cuts into it, okay? These two sliding actions backwards or forwards. The thrust, okay, which can be done from all different angles while you're using the left hand to either ward or grab or grapple or, you know, headlock or anything else the opponent. You can still be using your point, and thrusting is the main thing that is done in close range. And finally, pommeling, okay? Now, the sword is particularly well suited to pommeling because, number one, we've got a hard pommel at the end, which is where the word pummeling comes from, a good pummeling, being hit with a pommel. That's made of metal and has potentially angled edges, which are very unpleasant to be hit by. But in addition to that, the balance of the sword is near the hand. So actually it's quite wieldy and controllable in close range. That's the complete opposite with an axe. The problem with the axe is all the weight is at the top end. So if we're trying to pommel, it feels really weird. You can do it, okay? You absolutely can do it. Bam! You can hit with the butt end here, or you could punch with the shaft and all this kind of stuff. But the problem is you've got these two lateral projections sticking out at the back, which are rather close to your head, which I'm feeling quite uncomfortable about. But moreover, all of the weight is at the end of the weapon. So if you're trying to do things with this end of the weapon, it feels really awkward because all the mass is at the end. And of course, you can't really push cut and draw cut, and you can't thrust with these things. You can hook, admittedly, but that's not so useful at this distance, although can be sometimes. If you had a top spike, then that would make the weapon more effective in close range. And lo and behold, the poleaxe, which was used in armoured fighting in the 15th century, and before and after that as well, almost always has a top spike, and indeed usually a back spike as well. So in fact, this weapon sometimes we see drawn back fully here and used as a stabbing implement at distances where it's not appropriate to swing it. So generally speaking, in close, axes, in my opinion, and this is related to the grabbing point as well, are generally not as useful as pointy, thrusty, long-edged weapons, aka swords are. So I say, generally speaking, in close, at grappling range, axes are not very good. So the final point where I think axes are, it's kind of coupled with one of their advantages, but this can also be a massive disadvantage. So generally speaking, if one person picks up an axe and then they pick up a sword of a similar weight and they hack into, let's say, a pumpkin, okay? Generally speaking, most untrained people will go a lot deeper into the pumpkin with the top heavy axe than they will do with the sword. And there's a number of reasons for that. And one of the reasons is all of the weights at the end of the lever. Okay, it's pretty obvious how to use this thing, but also there's an awful lot of momentum because of that total mass. Most of it is at the end, and it's a forward projecting blade which penetrates into the target. That's also connected to its disadvantage. So what's the final disadvantage here? Quite simply, the axes can get stuck in things. Now, I suspect that most of you at some point have had a chop at some wood with an axe, and at some point you've had to wiggle it to get it back out of the wood. Now, this can of course happen to other wooden things. So you might be fighting against someone who has a wooden shafted weapon like this axe here, or something like a spear, but perhaps more commonly, some form of shield. Okay, now very often, whether you're hitting with a spike or a blade, this will penetrate the shield and it will get stuck. Now you could say, well, that's a good thing, it's going to destroy the shield more easily. True. It's possibly going to wound the person through the shield. There's a very famous viral video of this happening. Anyway, less about that said the better. Yes, absolutely, you can wound a person's arm through a shield with a sharp axe. However, there's also a very large chance, or at least a decent chance, that the edge of or the point, depending which you're using, of the axe will get stuck in the shield. Moreover, and this is a little bit grim and graphic, but axes can get stuck in bodies, and again, it happens. Now, that's not to say that other forms of blades, spears, swords, knives, all sorts of other things can't get stuck in bodies. In fact, they can, and they did in warfare. It's noted in World War I with bayonets, for example. But generally speaking, because of the nature of the axe, because it is a top-heavy weapon that chops perpendicular to the target, it is likely to go deep into something, whether wood or body, and potentially get stuck there. Now, obviously, that's not great for the person you've just hit. They've got an axe in them, so they might not be a problem for you anymore. But remember, in a martial setting, on a battlefield or a melee, skirmish, even self-defense, you don't really want your weapon getting stuck in the first opponent because there might be more opponents. In fact, there usually were historically, unless it was a duel, and if it was a duel, why were you using an axe? So you don't really want your axe getting stuck in people. And this might, this might lead to tactical choices about which type of blade to have on your axe, how sharp to make it, what shape to make it, or indeed whether to use the spike or the hammer. And, sometimes I'm pretty sure that people would have chosen to use the hammer on a warhammer type head or a poleaxe, or even on a tomahawk, rather than the blade for this reason. Or the blade's better for hooking, the hammer is not going to get stuck. In contrast, sword blades tend to go in and drag out because they are long, narrow, thin objects. They don't get stuck in the same way that axe blades do. Anyway, I hope this has given you a little bit of a different way to look at axes. Do you think there are any other major disadvantages, or rather overlooked and obscure disadvantages? Obviously, there's some kind of headline disadvantages to axes, like the fact that they usually have shafts made of wood. And for example, if I just grab an Indian axe here, which I recently bought from auction, then this type of axe has got a relatively fragile shaft. So going against swords, the shaft is going to perish, less so with a big Dane axe here. But nevertheless, there are some clear disadvantages to axes, but can you think of any other obscure ones? This is also a way of highlighting the context behind why swords were so popular to wear, because they have a lot of inherent advantages over axes, even if axes have some advantages over swords, and of course are cheaper. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton, I'll continue to be, hopefully, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks!
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.